When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject: The Grave of Dennis Ozowski. User: Pindelair. Posted May 1st, 1997.
Right now, skinny young men in flannel shirts singing songs about despair and finding themselves at right angles to the world are playing out of every radio and boombox across the country. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot to be said for grunge, and I think time will be kind to songwriters like Kurt Cobain and Eddie Vedder. It's just that there's not much hope in that music. Dennis Ozowski, though, in the brief time I knew him, radiated hope like a miniature sun, one shaped like a chubby Midwestern guitarist who loved cigarettes and Lucky Charms. I'd say the world could use more men like him, but I don't think that many are made. I think that, like Dennis, they come along when we need them most, give of themselves, and in the process, disappear. Dennis Ozowski arrived into my life fully formed, and if you told me he'd arrived into the world that way too, I'd believe you. It was the winter of 1989, and I was working for an accounting firm in Midtown. Every day, I'd take the subway into the city, getting off at Penn Station before walking the 4 blocks to my firm. Then, one random Wednesday, I was having the worst morning imaginable. It had been raining for days, my socks were wet, and I'd been mugged coming in on the train. I was in a funk, to put it mildly. I stepped onto the platform and heard a song coming from somewhere on the other side of the crowd of commuters that made me feel lighter than air. A man's voice was singing it, and it had the familiarity of a song you've heard 100 times but can't quite name. I later found out it was original to him. The song washed away all the tension built up since the mugging. It wasn't that it made me forget about what happened, as much as I suddenly felt capable of looking past it. The mugger hadn't taken all my cash, and I'd come out unharmed. Really, it was the best-case version of a bad scenario. He had, however, taken my watch, and a glance at the clock on the station wall told me I was running way behind, so I didn't meet the mysterious vocalist that day. It was a week later, another Wednesday, when I pushed my way toward the source of the music. He was young, no older than 22, 23, with a head of shaggy black hair and a belly that extended over the waist of his black sweatpants. Once he had finished his tune, I introduced myself, and he said it was nice to meet me. After a moment of awkward silence, I asked what his name was, and he looked confused, as if not expecting the question. Hurriedly, he introduced himself as Dennis Ozowski. This was, I'd eventually learn, typical Dennis. He didn't really understand social conventions like a space alien who'd been plunked down to Earth, guitar in hand. Of course, he wasn't actually a space alien, at least no more than anyone else from Minneapolis. That's not to say I'm totally sure what he was. I don't think he knew himself. There was something in the singer's easygoing manner that put me at ease, and I invited him out for lunch, an invitation he declined. Wednesdays, he said, were the only days he got to perform on the platform. Coming out here any other day of the week, he averred, would infringe on someone else's time, and he didn't feel that was right. Instead, I offered him lunch at the 2nd Avenue Deli the following day, which he accepted with a delightful smile. Over matzo ball soup, something he marveled at, the concept of meatless meatballs apparently being new to him, Dennis told me he'd come to New York after the death of his grandmother, who had raised him. His own parents were nebulous, mysterious figures rarely spoken of. Mostly, his entire world could be reduced down to his grandmother and the guitar she taught him to play. My granny was sick for a long time, he said. Cancer. But my music made her feel better. She told me it would take away her aches and pains, so I'd play till my fingers bled. She showed those doctors. They gave her 2 years, and instead, we got another 10. Hadn't it bothered him, I asked, that he'd spent his formative years alone with his grandmother and not out making friends? He shook his head. I never got on well with other kids anyways. Not for lack of trying, it's more that they all seem to know what to say and when to say it, and I don't. They close ranks. I understood. It wasn't personal, just human nature. And I had Granny, so there was nothing to miss. The death of his grandmother had been the thing which sent Dennis on the odyssey that led him here. 4 years on the road, hitchhiking first from Minneapolis to the Pacific Northwest, then across the plains to Chicago, supporting himself by playing and singing in roadhouses, truck stops, really anywhere that let him sit long enough to take his guitar out. Money, he said, would find him when he needed it most, but it was still a lean way to live. Saying this, he smiled and self-consciously patted his stomach. I guess God wanted me to have company out there. No matter how much time there was between meals, the old gut never got smaller. Go figure, eh? The healing power of his music had proved to work on other people too. Word got out among truck drivers that there was a guitar player on the highway who played away what ailed you in exchange for a ride. Dennis says he lost count of how much gout and back pain the men said he had cured over the dozens of rides he was given. His story trailed off into a chuckle before he blushed and added, "A few said I cured their VD too, though I didn't ask for proof. Some offered, believe me. No, thank you." Surprisingly to me, sex was the one subject in which he had very little interest. All the guitar players I knew back in college picked up the instrument with the express goal of getting laid, but not Dennis. According to him, the notes occupied his head more than anything else. Over the course of those years on the road, he learned how to divine which combos of notes performed which healings. He claimed there were songs for inflammation, songs for broken bones, even ones for emotions to ward off sadness, anger, despair. Those songs only work for a little while, he said ruefully. But my grandmother used to say a moment of peace is worth a lifetime of holler, so maybe a little while is enough. I mostly play those ones in the subway to see if I can't ease everyone's day some. When I asked him if he could tell when his music was healing someone, he nodded. What, I wanted to know, did it feel like? His face clouded over and took a sip of his coffee. Like I'm giving part of myself away. It's the best and worst thing in the world. When first setting out from Minneapolis, Dennis said he hadn't known exactly where he was meant to end up. Then, 6 months ago, he'd been living on the couch of a woman named Joanna who ran a hospice clinic in Muncie, Indiana. She provided free end-of-life care for people whose insurance couldn't or wouldn't cover their costs. He would play songs to prolong the lives of those who wished it and to take away the pain for those who didn't. A dream sent him on a different path. If not for what I saw that night, I might have stayed there until Joanna closed the place, or I passed on myself, whichever came first. The dream changed all that. It was horrible. Fire falling from the sky, the streets full of rubble, of bodies, men, women, children, everyone. Worst of all, there was no hope, no unity. Whatever had happened, it broke their spirits completely. Slowly, I began to hear a song over the crying and the sirens, the most beautiful song I'd ever heard. Once it played, the scene in front of me transformed. I couldn't stop what happened, but everything that came after was different. People banded together, pulling each other up and out of the wreckage. They set up field hospitals, organized search parties for the lost, again, only for a little while, but maybe a little while is enough. When it was over, I knew I had to come here and teach myself the song. I tried pressing him for details. What was the catastrophe he saw? When was it coming? And got nothing but shrugs. I don't know. All I know was that I had to come here and learn the song. Once I do, everything else will become clear. Over the months that followed, Dennis and I would talk regularly on my way to and from work. There were more lunches, too. I introduced him to the wonders of pho and sushi, but delis were his favorite. I'd ask him how the song was coming along, and he'd always call it a real puzzler. The whole thing was so unlikely that I would sometimes still doubt it was real. Then I'd step off the train on a Wednesday morning, and his notes would be bouncing off the station's tiled walls. My shoulders would drop, my heart rate would slow, and for the rest of the day, not another thing in this world could bother me. Finally, one day in January, he saw me get off the train and called me over. The song was finally finished, he said, and he had been waiting for me before he played it. He said that in the process of learning the song, he had come to understand that the spell was so big, he'd have to give more of himself than ever before. When I asked him exactly how much, he gave me a wan smile, saying quietly, all of it. Before I could think of what to say, he thanked me for all the lunches, for being the first friend he'd had since his grandmother. With that, he began playing the most beautiful tune I've ever heard. It was soft and sweet, yet full of strength. The notes seemed to build and build, twisting around one another until you could see them in the air, golden sparks fizzing into life. The more he picked, the more content Dennis looked, and the more commuters stopped to watch. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced before, like a communal prayer. The gold in the air was joined by pinpricks of bright red swirling around one another like a conjurer's trick. Gradually, I became aware that the longer the light show went on, the softer the watching faces became, the cynicism of a city melting away. It wasn't the only thing disappearing. Sparks began to fly off his body, too, as if he were dissolving. Suddenly, I knew what he meant by all of it. and I wanted him to stop. Dennis must have seen the look on my face because he silently mouthed something, a phrase that wouldn't make sense to anyone there but me. It's only for a little while. A moment later, his face took on a beatific expression, and the air in the station turned white as the sound of his guitar and my heart swelled. After the white light faded, those of us assembled on the platform looked at one another with a sense of connection I've never known before. Fragments of gold and red still danced high up by the ceiling, spreading outwards in their thousands. As for Dennis, he was gone, his hope winding its way out of the subway and into the city, his gift. I don't know what awaits this city in the future, but I know that when we pull together instead of falling apart, it'll be because of Dennis Ozowski and what he gave to us that day.
Subject, blood ties. User, Trifect8. Posted, June 28, 1998.
Jerry always said he'd protect me, always promised nothing bad would happen to his little brother, and I'd be lying if I told you he ever broke that promise, even after he disappeared. My brother was 16 and full of angst the last time I saw him. Our stepfather was a real piece of work, a fat bastard with a mean streak and a drinking habit to match. The two of them butted heads constantly, and while most nights it was just yelling, sometimes it got real ugly. To this day, I still resent our neighbors for never calling the cops. Luckily, though, Jerry could hold his own. He was wiry and quick, and when that old man swung, my big brother always managed to duck or fight back just enough to keep him at bay, just long enough for the prick to either run out of steam or just decide pouring another drink down his gullet was more important than beating the shit out of us. Me, I was the runt. Skittish as can be, and honestly, still am. I take after my mom. All flight, no fight. So yeah, I relied on my brother when he told me he'd protect me, and he always did. He was the only person in my life who did that, but after the night Jerry snuck out of the house, that sense of security started to fade fast. The argument that night was worse than usual, louder, meaner, but like I said, the old man only had so much gas in the tank, so it didn't last long. When he finally passed out, snoring on that stained recliner with a pile of cans next to him, Jerry took off. He'd asked me to cover for him, said he just needed to cool down. I'll be back before anyone notices, but he never did. For weeks, Mom was a wreck. The bastard pretended to care and put on a real performance, acting like he was our savior, calling the cops, checking in with neighbors. He even passed out flyers around town. For a second, I thought maybe he'd finally stepped up. Maybe as bad as it was that Jerry was gone, this prick would realize the error of his ways. But that illusion came crashing down fast when the cops showed up late one night. They found my stepfather behind Frank's bar on Powerline, dead as a doornail. Turns out the asshole wasn't actually searching for Jerry after all. He was spending his nights getting hammered and chasing tail while Mom was at home practically catatonic. But that wasn't even the most shocking part. No, the real kicker was how he died. When they found him, he was laying in a pool of his own blood, his body was ripped to shreds like he'd been attacked by a bear or something. There were pieces of flesh dangling off his bones, and a look of horror was still frozen on his face. He saw something before he died that clearly made him realize that this was the end. Mom didn't spiral like I thought she would. In fact, it was like the clouds lifted. She stopped crying, stopped jumping every time the phone rang. I think she figured Jerry would come back now that the bastard was gone, but he never did, and life just sort of went on with just the two of us. For years, I did my best to bury all of these things, to try not to think about any of it as much as I possibly could. Not the bastard, not the blood, and not Jerry. Sure, it affected everything I did. It was traumatic, but I just boxed it up and moved on. And that worked for years until last week, I got a call from the cops that brought it all crashing back. It was about Dominic, my bookie. We had a complicated history, Dom and me. He was the guy who let me dig my way into a mountain of debt with every bad bet I made. I'm sure it's no surprise that with the way I was raised, this was bound to happen. But yeah, I had a bit of an issue with cash. Anyway, Dom was a good bookie, and I don't mean because he had great customer service. It was the opposite. He was a great bookie because he wasn't patient and he wasn't forgiving. If you owed him cash, he found a way to get it. Well, last year, it was time to pay up, and I, the degenerate gambler that I am, couldn't pay for it, so I started working for him. He liked guys like me for that. Little runts, scared of enforcers, who'd do anything not to get hurt. I ran errands, collected debts, whatever he asked. I figured it would keep him off my back. Well, according to the detective on the phone, they found Dom's body in his car outside of some strip mall rub and tug. At first, I felt a sigh of relief, but the detective made it clear that this wasn't any ordinary murder. Dom had been brutally attacked by something vicious, and they wanted to speak to me immediately. I agreed, hung up the phone, threw on some clothes, and headed downtown. The streets were empty as I drove, just me and my thoughts. But then at the corner of 5th and Belmont, I hit a red light, and that's when I saw him. Jerry. Or at least, I thought it was Jerry. He was standing under the street lamp, leaning against the pole like he didn't have a care in the world. At first, I thought it was someone else, just a guy with a similar build, but then he turned toward me. Same sharp features, same crooked grin. He looked exactly the way he had the night he snuck out. My stomach flipped. He nodded slow and deliberate, like he was acknowledging me, but when I blinked, he was gone. I don't know how I made it to the station. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. When I got there, the detective filled in the blanks. Dom wasn't just dead, slumped over in his car like he had a heart attack. No, he had been brutally shredded just like my stepfather had all those years ago. Blood soaked everything inside that old Lincoln. Instantly, I knew that really was Jerry.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.